Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. At least that's what my grandfather says. I guess you can be the judge of that. Anyway, I live in Pennsylvania now, but my family is from down south. Deep south. My grandmother was a school teacher and my grandfather was a cop. This was back in the day when they used prisoners as labor, so Grandpa did some time guarding chain gangs. Basically, prisoners were required to work to clean roadsides, road construction, dig ditches, that kind of thing. Grandpa was one of the sheriffs on guard duty, which meant he got to stand around in the hot sun, shotgun on his shoulder, and monitor the men. He was a hard case, but he was never one of those guards who tolerated people getting hurt, no matter what side of the badge they were on. He made sure the men got water and rest when they needed it, but mostly his job was to make sure no one went wandering and the work got done. This one story I want to tell you about happened back in the summer of 1958. The chain gang was called out to dig out some drainage ditches along the highway outside of Guntersville, which is southeast of Huntsville. It's a nice town right on the lake. Cleaning drainage ditches isn't easy, but it's necessary work. None of the convicts liked it. Hard labor in hot weather. Mosquitoes were the size of fishing boats, slogging in mucky water, digging out marsh plants that really didn't want to be dug out, and cleaning up trash. So, you can imagine there was plenty of complaining. My grandpa said most of the men just stuck to complaining under their breath because some of the guards weren't too keen on chit-chat. Grandpa mostly kept to himself and did his patrol, walking up and down the convict line along where they worked alongside the road. I said before that Grandpa had a dog with him. He was a German shepherd named Arizona, and he took his job about as seriously as Grandpa did. He was all business when they walked the line. So when the dog was alerted, you know how their head goes up and their ears go straight. My grandfather took note. So one of the convicts started slapping at the water where he was standing. It was waist deep, thick with tall weeds and dark brown with all the mud they were kicking up. Couldn't see a thing. But he was yelling loud and clear that there was something in the water biting at him. Now, a drainage ditch isn't Lake Guntersville, but it's still water, so it's not a shock that something besides the men might be in it. My grandfather would have been more inclined to tell him to just pipe down, except for how Arizona was reacting. Grandpa called for the nearest corrections officer to help him, and they pulled the man up out of the water. Now, you can't pull someone on a chain gang very far without pulling the rest of them, but they did get him out enough to see what the fuss was, and sure enough, his jumpsuit was shredded. When they rolled up the pant legs, they could see welts, dozens of them, as if something had bitten him. Well, Grandpa tells it like they assumed it was leeches, because that's a thing, but while they were figuring out what to do, another one of the convicts started jumping up and down, yelling. Now, there's always a risk that the men on the chain gang were trying to pull one over on the guards so they could escape. But Grandpa looked over at his dog again, and Arizona was staring at the water in the ditch and whining. He gave the order to pull all the men out of that ditch. That didn't sit right with a few of the other guards, but Grandpa was firm. It helped that the other dog on site was acting the same way, staring at the water and whining, ears flat like they were scared. When they pulled the line up, the other prisoner who'd been shouting also had torn clothes. But there was something else there. The way Grandpa tells the story is that his legs were covered in little white things. Grandpa said they looked like leeches, if leeches had arms and legs. I remember that I actually interrupted the story to ask if he was sure. I asked what they looked like, and he said in a very hushed voice, they had spindly little arms like tiny, skinny tree branches, but they ended in even tinier three-fingered hands and feet, and those things dug into that poor man's skin like the worst burr you ever saw. The prisoner started yelling something awful as soon as he saw those things. I don't even know what to call them. He tried to run, and of course, since they were all chained together, this yanked the closest prisoners onto the ground with him. Half the chain gang was standing as far away as the chains would allow, and the other half, the ones closest to the lakeside of the road, were all down in the dirt in the weeds alongside the road. The guards tried to pull the creatures off his legs, but they were rubbery and hard to get hold of. Or maybe it was because they were so slimy and disgusting that no one really wanted to touch them. Even the dogs were whining and backing up, acting like scared puppies rather than the working dogs they were. They could have just dragged the entire prisoner line into the bus and brought everyone back to the jail for the infirmary to take care of it, but these things were uncanny. There was just something about them. Grandpa said the sheriff tried to yank off the biggest leech creature, but the thing just clung tighter. Blood was running down the con's leg as he wailed. One of the guards suggested cutting the head off, like a lamprey. "Did that work?" I asked. From the look on my grandfather's face, I already knew the answer. We cut it at the neck, took the body clean off, but the head, it stayed. I could see it burrow deeper into the muscle. I don't mind telling you I was feeling pretty grossed out by this story, but I was also invested. I needed to see where this went. "So, what happened?" I asked. "We burned them," he said. Apparently one of the other officers got the notion to grab the cigarette lighter out of the police cruiser so they could try to burn them off. Grandpa told me that they shoved the hot metal against the back of the biggest leech's head, and it worked. The leech popped off with its mouth open, like it was screaming. It had a head like a lamprey, all teeth and blood, with tiny black eyes and no nose. Once it was loose, Grandpa grabbed, threw it on the ground, and used his heavy boot on it. The sheriff told him to keep doing that while the rest of them unchained the prisoners who hadn't gotten anything on them to lead them back to the bus. Grandpa was stuck with the disgusting duty of removing whatever those things were, and that's when he got an idea. He ran back to the cruiser and pulled out a half-empty box of shotgun shells, dumped the shells in his pocket, and ran back to the prisoner. When they pulled off the next leech thing, he killed it but stuck the body in the box and ran that back to the car, where he locked it in the glove box. When he got back, the other officers were pulling off the last of the things. They'd just gotten to the last few when the dogs went on alert. Grandpa trusted Arizona more than anything, so when his dog looked out at the lake beyond the drainage ditch, he looked too. Couldn't see anything though, so he went back to burning off the critters. But Arizona was agitated, pacing at the edge of the ditch, so Grandpa looked again. There was something in the water, under the water. He could see the ripple of something moving. It looked big, and it looked like it was heading their way, fast. Grandpa shouted to get away from the ditch, and that was when the other dogs started whining, then growling, then going to full-on barking. The prisoners did what they could to scramble out of range of the water, but even if they weren't chained on a line, their ankles were still chained together, and that limited how fast they could move. I point that out because the next thing Grandpa told me was how the water at the shoreline of the lake where it met the drainage ditch exploded. He said it just went up like God had turned on a fountain, but what came out of it was nothing the Lord ever made. At first he thought it was a gator. Not that they had them in those parts, but it could have been that one came up the river from the bayous and stayed. But gators don't stand up. This thing did. It had a hide like a gator, all scaled and green and slick, like armor, with a gator's underbelly too, but it had arms and shoulders like a man. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the head. Teeth like a lamprey and an open gash of a mouth, black eyes, no nose. And it screamed. My grandfather was a big, tough guy, even when he was old, and he still turned white when he told me how it sounded. Like a shriek straight from hell. It moved before anybody else could do anything besides whispering prayers to the Almighty and went for the closest convict. It was the other man with bites on his legs, but none of the leech critters. Arizona and the other dog went for it, latching onto its arm and a leg like they were trained to do. The prisoner was screaming because the thing had its claws in him. Grandpa said you could smell the blood over the stink of the ditch water. He unholstered his shotgun and fired dead center. He knew he hit it because the thing staggered and screamed again. Staggered, yes, but it didn't stop. It ripped that poor convict's leg clear to the bone. By this time, most of the other officers were calling off the dogs and unloading on it. It went back into the water, leaving a dying man and a bunch of prisoners, and cops who had no idea what had just happened. If you're wondering what happened after that, I can tell you what Grandpa said. They tried to save the mauled man, but he didn't make it. He died on the scene. The rest of the chain gang got brought back to the penitentiary. Now you have to remember that this was in the 50s, and there were two things on everyone's mind. So when they got back to the jail, the sheriff called up the FBI to tell them they had a report. Either it was a red menace or it was an alien, but either way, it wasn't a local jurisdiction thing. My grandpa used to joke that the feds were always a day late and $1 short on the best days, but pretty soon, men in suits were at the jail, taking testimony and grilling everyone like a cheap steak. The body of the convict was confiscated. Evidence, they said. The witnesses were all ordered not to talk, and then the feds disappeared. A public service announcement went out later that night, warning people to stay away from the lake. Rogue gator. A man-eater. I asked my grandpa why he was telling me this now if he'd been warned not to talk about it, and he laughed. Who'd believe me? That was when I remembered that he'd put the body of one of those leech things in his car. Didn't he have that? But my grandfather shook his head and told me that he'd had the same thought after the feds left, but when he got back to his cruiser, the ammo box was gone. No proof. No story. And the feds must have done something about whatever was in the lake, because only one fisherman went missing after that. A crazy story from a confused old man. Or the truth. All I know is I never go near that section of Lake Guntersville just to be on the safe side. I was driving a logging truck on a project in northeastern British Columbia. It was an extremely remote area. If I'm honest, it was a little creepy if you had to drive the logging road at night. It felt like driving through a tunnel of trees, like the trees were going to reach out and grab you. It took a while to get used to it. The native stories about the area didn't help. I knew some First Nation guys who wouldn't set foot in those forests, but I was never one to believe stuff like that. The biggest problem I had was the deer. That's what I was afraid of. The forest was so dense that you couldn't see them standing in the shadows at the edge of the road. We had elk and moose up there too, but they seemed to keep off the road for the most part. The deer, on the other hand, would jump out right at your truck. I knew there were other animals out there in the woods, like bears and wolves. Animals you definitely didn't want to run into. Animals that were dangerous. But there's something else that lives out there with them. Something only found in the very far north of Canada. The local First Nations tribe called it a medicine bear. It was said to have sacred spiritual powers, and seeing one was extremely rare, and either very lucky or unlucky depending on who you talked to. I heard other stories calling it a ghost, a spirit from an ancient past, some poor creature that was long dead and lost in time. They said it couldn't be killed. People have claimed to shoot it, only to have the bullet pass straight through, as if the animal itself wasn't real. The creature would just look at them without even a flinch. I never heard any stories of it attacking someone, but there was always a hint of danger to the tales. A few people were convinced it was some prehistoric creature that somehow survived undetected in the remote north of Canada. And after working up there for a while, I wouldn't be at all surprised that an ancient species managed to stay hidden for thousands of years. The forests are so remote they are barely accessible to humans. Just beyond the area we were logging was a huge national park reserve that was only reachable by bush plane. There were very few people around, if any. After seeing the creature myself, I know what my theory is, but I'll let you decide for yourself. I was driving back along the logging road. It had taken a bit longer to load the trailer than I had planned for, so I was stuck driving the road at night. The headlights illuminated the way directly in front of me, but I felt engulfed in darkness. I don't know why, but the night always felt darker out here. Maybe it was the lack of light pollution or the cover of the trees surrounding the road. It was unsettling to say the least. I was always looking out for deer, and that night one of my worst fears came true. I never saw them at the edge of the road. It was just too dark. Two of the deer made it across the road, but I plowed right into the third. Luckily, it wasn't a big enough impact to cause me to lose control. I stopped the truck as soon as I was able to investigate the damage. I cursed the deer for being so stupid. There was no way they didn't hear my truck or see the headlights, but of course, they had to run out right in front of me. But then I heard something moving through the forest behind me. It was quiet, but there was definitely something out there. And then I realized that the 3 deer that ran out in front of me weren't being suicidal at all. They were being chased. I saw it walk out into the road. I shined my flashlight at it. It looked at me briefly, acknowledging my existence, but it didn't seem to care. It was focused on the deer that lay dead in the ditch. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing was the size of a horse. It was bigger than any bear I had ever seen. Its fur was solid white and shaggy. It had the head of what looked like a wolf, but it was more blocky and its muzzle was wider, like some sort of cross between a wolf and a bear. It walked on its toes like a wolf did, but its shoulders were significantly higher than its hips. There was an angle to its hind legs that was dog-like. Think of a hyena, and that's kind of what it moved like. I could see how people mistook it for both a wolf and a bear, but it was actually something in the middle. The creature had no interest in me at all. Its only focus was the dead deer. It walked across the road and into the ditch and began tearing open the deer. I watched it for a moment, having a hard time believing what I was seeing in front of me. This was definitely the animal from the stories, but what exactly was it? I had no idea. I don't think it was a ghostly spirit, or why would it need to eat? I don't think it was some sort of evil monster either. It didn't try to attack me. It acted like a wild animal looking for an easy meal. I don't know how our encounter would have gone if the dead deer wasn't in the ditch. But then again, the incident with the deer was the entire reason I was standing there outside my truck in the first place. I didn't tell anyone what I saw up there. There were a few guys I worked with that would have taken the opportunity to hunt the beast, hoping to capture some sort of mythical trophy just for the sake of killing. Did the creature look dangerous? Oh yes, but I didn't think it wanted much to do with humans. I was standing outside next to it with only a flashlight, and it didn't try to attack me, even though I was near its food. So I decided to keep it a secret. I won't disclose the exact area I saw it, but it was very far north. So far north that something like that could remain hidden for a very long time. I was doing some field work near the Centennial Valley. I was in college at the time, going for a degree in conservation. I found a summer job testing water quality in various areas across the valley. Some days were easy, some were hard. It all depended on the location of the samples I needed to collect. Centennial Valley is big on conservation. It lies just west of Yellowstone and is a massive migration field for local wildlife. The valley itself is made up of mostly grasslands and wetlands, but it is surrounded by mountains on both sides. The lower part of the mountains are covered in thick forests. It's some rough country out there. Beautiful, but very dangerous if you don't know your way around. We were required to make notes of any animal encounters we had while working in the field. There was an ongoing study of the wildlife populations in the valley, so they wanted everyone working out there to record what they could. We didn't have to note birds or marmots, just the big things like deer, elk, bison, bears, moose, and wolves. I didn't have a whole lot of animal encounters that summer. I saw a few elk early in the year and a brown dot off in the distance that looked like a grizzly bear, but I wasn't close enough to be certain. I was extra cautious about bears in the area, and moose. I was terrified of running into a moose. I was naive to think bears and moose were the most dangerous things in the valley. There's something else living out there that didn't make it into my field notes. I didn't think anyone would believe me, so I've kept quiet about it until now. It was towards the end of the season. I was collecting water samples from a river that ran through the valley. It was an area only accessible by an ATV. This particular river was a main water source for several species of wildlife in the nearby area, so animal sightings weren't uncommon. As soon as I reached the river, I smelled something rotten. I knew right away that it was a carcass of some kind, but I couldn't see it right away. They made all of us take a bear safety course before we began working in the valley. Part of that course told us to stay very far away from any animal carcasses in case a bear was guarding the area. I didn't bother with the water samples. I started to turn the ATV around when I saw the carcass. It was an elk. Its antlers were peeking out of the tall grass. I had to drive right past it to get the ATV turned around. It was strange. Its body looked fresh, but it smelled like it had been dead for weeks. There weren't any wounds that I could see on the animal. It was skinny, but other than that, its body looked fine. Usually bears rip into the lower abdomen first. There are less bones there, but this animal was intact. And then I saw its head. All of the skin had been removed. It was only a skull, but it was still attached to the body of the elk. I didn't know what to think of it, but I knew I had to get out of there. I reported the carcass to the lead ranger overseeing my project, and the area was closed for a couple of weeks. This was to keep us safe from any potential bear encounters. But like I said, that wasn't the real danger out there. 2 days later, I was sent to a different location. This area was a marshy wetland. It was about 35 miles away from where I had found the elk carcass. I hiked to the edge of where the marshy area began to get my water samples when I was overcome by the smell of something dead. What were the odds that I stumbled upon 2 animal carcasses in less than a week? I slowly backed away from the edge of the water, scanning for any signs of predators in the area. I didn't see anything, nor did I see any tracks on the way in. I had about 50 yards to hike back to the ATV, and it felt like the longest 50 yards of my life. I had a can of bear spray with me, but I knew that wouldn't stop a bear if it was defending a meal. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw elk antlers in the grass. It was the same thing I had seen 2 days prior. A dead elk with no visible wound, no signs of predation, except for the skull. All of the skin had been removed from the skull. If I didn't know better, I would say it was the exact same animal I had seen before, but that was impossible. Both animals were dead and separated by a good 35 miles. I finally reached the ATV and got out of there as quickly as was safe. It was an odd experience, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. It bothered me, but I tried not to think about it. What was out there skinning the heads of these elk and leaving their bodies intact? And why haven't any predators found them? I would get my answer about a week later. I was sent out to a river on the far side of the valley. It was the same story. As soon as I got there, I smelled that rotting smell, and I just knew. I don't know how, but I knew. I knew it wasn't 2 dead elk that I found. This was some sort of creature, and it was following me. Like an idiot, I yelled out to it. I told it I knew it was out there, and I knew it wasn't dead, even though it had been pretending to be. And then I heard something rustling in grasses behind me. It was the creature. It had been lying down, no doubt pretending again to be dead. I couldn't see any eyes in the black holes of its skull, but I still knew it was looking right at me. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. Its body was that of an emaciated elk, but it had no skin on its head. It somehow looked both alive and dead at the same time. Its legs were spindly, and the way it moved was odd. It was like the creature was about to collapse with every step, but I knew if it reached me, it could probably kill me. It looked at me, lowered its head, and blew air out of its exposed nasal passages. I bolted to the ATV and spun it around as fast as I could. That thing had been following me. I knew that much. I don't know what its plans were, but I knew they weren't anything good, and I didn't intend to stay and find out. The creature didn't follow me out that I could see. I stopped doing field work that day, and I never saw anything like it ever again. I have nightmares about it sometimes, about what it wanted to do to me, and why it didn't kill me when I first discovered it playing dead in the grass. I took a long enough look at it that it could have jumped up and reached me without a problem. I don't suppose I'll ever get answers to any of those questions. It's probably better that way. This encounter takes place in Trego County, Kansas in the summer of 1999. I'm going to leave my name out of this, but here's my story. I was born and raised near Trego County, Kansas. It's a small town with a population of just a few thousand people, but it's home to me. I grew up on a farm experiencing all the ups and downs that come with country living, but I loved it. I still do. We are a family of 6, and I am the oldest daughter with 3 younger brothers. My family all loved the smell of the dirt in the air, and I loved spending long hours outside playing with my brothers. We would chase each other around the fields or play games of tag in the barn. Mom and Dad always tried to give us a good life, and they worked hard to provide for us. We were never wealthy, but we were always happy, and we knew the value of hard work. I went to school right here in Trego County, and then I went off to college. I was the first in my family to do so, but I was headstrong and wanted to learn about marketing and other ways that I wanted to try and help the farm. I always knew that I wanted to come back home, though, too. And so, after I graduated, I moved back to the farm and lived there helping my mom and dad while also working down the road at Shiloh Vineyard and Winery. So anyway, back during the summer that this encounter happened in 1999, one of my favorite ways to spend my weekends was at Cedar Bluff State Park. It's just a short drive from the farm, only about 20 minutes, and it's the perfect place to get away from it all. The park is surrounded by beautiful forests, and there's a river running through it with a huge reservoir lake. It's the perfect place to go fishing, or to just relax and take in the scenery. I always feel so refreshed after spending a long day at the park because it's a great escape from the bustle and chores of everyday life. Anyway, I was starting to feel a little bit stagnant at work. I loved my job, but I was starting to feel like I needed a change. I was also feeling a lot of stress from work. My boss was always putting a lot of pressure on me because they were short-staffed at the time, and I was starting to feel like I couldn't handle it all. It even got to the point where I started to dread going into work, and I was constantly feeling anxious. So I went hiking at Cedar Bluff State Park, where I knew I would be able to clear my head. The park is the perfect place for that. It's quiet and peaceful, and it's a great escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. So I was hiking along my favorite trail when I saw something moving in the bushes up ahead. It caught my eye because it wasn't the normal kind of movement that I'm used to seeing while hiking. At first I thought it might be a deer, but then I realized that it was way too big to just be a deer. The bushes were moving in such a way that I knew the thing had to be huge. I started thinking and trying to figure out what it could be, but no good answers came to mind. So I slowly approached the bushes as they moved back and forth, and when I got close, that's when everything went quiet. I couldn't hear the birds anymore, and the only sound was the sound of my heart beating. I slowly parted the bushes, and that's when I saw it, and everything clicked into slow motion. Its fur was matted and black, and it was staring at me with these cold, dead eyes. I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear looking into the blackness of this creature. The creature slowly started to step towards me, and I could feel the fear coursing through my veins. I honestly felt that this could be it, the day I was going to die. I watched as the thing approached. The creature was so tall, I couldn't even see its head as the sun threw its body into a silhouette. I knew it was staring down at me, though, and I felt small, weak, and insignificant in comparison. I didn't know what it was. I could only make out the outline, but it definitely wasn't anything I had ever seen before. If I had been able to think at the time, I would have felt like I was in a horror movie. The poor girl that gets attacked by a creature on a deserted trail. One thing I can say, though, is that the creature had wolf or dog-like characteristics, with a long snout and sharp teeth. It seemed to be studying me, as if it was trying to figure out what I was while it loomed over me. I didn't know what to make of it, but I was definitely scared. I also can say that I remember its smell. It smelled strange, like something I had never smelled before, but familiar all at the same time. It was musty and earthy, but not in a pleasant way, and it made my skin crawl. I can't say for sure how long we were in that position, me huddled to the ground and this beast looming over me, when suddenly I heard the sound of branches snapping about 20 or 30 feet away. I'm sure the creature must have heard the noise too, because it turned its head, and then it ran away into the woods towards the noise. I was shaking, and I could barely breathe. I had never been so scared in my life as I watched it disappear into the trees, moving quickly as if it had been activated by hearing the noise that we both heard, moving quickly like in a hunting kind of a way. And even though I was scared, I also couldn't help but be curious about what it was, wondering what it was exactly what it was doing in the woods, and why it was so curious about and interested in me. I didn't know how to qualify it all in my head. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that right then and there, I decided to leave the park and go home. I was so shaken up, but I managed to get myself out of the park and back to my car and back onto the highway. I couldn't stop thinking about that creature, though, and I'm pretty sure it was following me as I left, not in a way that it wanted me to see it, but in a way that it was curious, but didn't want to be seen. I say this because I feel like I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the woods along the exit road as I left. It wasn't until I got home that everything seemed to come back to me, and I could finally take a breath. But for the rest of the day, and even weeks later, I felt like that creature had somehow changed me and changed my perspective on life and what's important. I told my parents about the creature, and of course they were skeptical. But I was adamant about what I had seen, and eventually they started to believe me. They even helped me look up information about the creature online, and we found out that it was a kind of creature that has been reported in all other parts of the world. Even the descriptions we read online match what I experienced. Ever since that day, I've been back to the woods several times, but never alone. I always took a friend, or one of my brothers, with me. Always in the daylight and never at dusk or dark, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature again. But I never have. Despite the fear I experienced, I've come to be enchanted by it in a way. I like to think that it's still out there somewhere, living its life in the woods, undisturbed by humans. Maybe one day I'll see it again, but for now I'm content with just knowing that it exists. My girlfriend and I live in an older duplex in a residential area of Connecticut. The surrounding homes are all older, and there's an old mill that's been turned into loft apartments right down the street. Basically, we're surrounded by history, and the architecture is beautiful. We got lucky with our apartment. It's in an older brick building with 12-foot-high ceilings and a lot of character. We live on the first floor. That'll be important later on. About 8 months into living here, Sarah and I were prepping for Halloween. Both of us grew up in big families and have a handful of nieces and nephews, so we get really excited for this holiday and go all out. Pumpkins, a lot of candy, and a scary soundtrack playing. We were finishing up a TV show at around 6 that night, and it was just starting to get dark, so we decided to turn the porch light on and hang out in the kitchen area. Now, to get into our apartment, you have to walk up a small porch, open the front door, which is always unlocked, and enter into a small foyer. To the left is a staircase that goes up to our neighbor's apartment. Our door is immediately across from the front door, about 4 or 5 feet. Right next to the stairs on the left is another door that goes down to the basement. Sarah and I checked out the basement when we first moved in, as it was offered as storage space, and it's huge. It was well kept, but definitely old with a lot of nooks and crannies. There are probably at least 4 separate lights down there, and like the rest of the building, it's all brick. The basement door has a latch on it, one of those complicated ones that slides and then fits into a notch. We always keep it locked unless the landlady gives us a heads up that a technician is coming. So on Halloween night, we were having a beer and chatting in the kitchen when we heard the front door into the foyer open. That was a little weird since our neighbors were all home upstairs and trick-or-treaters usually knock. I walked over and looked through the peephole to see if a trick-or-treater had invited themselves in. But no one was in the hallway. Thinking it might just be a draft, we went back to chatting and hanging out, keeping an eye out for families walking by. Eventually, we heard a group out on the porch and stepped out of the apartment to the front door. But as we did so, we noticed the basement door was open. Not much, just an inch or two. But that was weird. It hadn't been opened when I'd looked out the peephole only a few minutes ago. Sarah shut it and we handed out candy, chatting with the kids' parents for a little bit before they went on their way. I gave the basement door another glance as we went back into the apartment but didn't say anything. A few more groups came and went, and then we had a bit of a lull. At around 7:30, we decided to take the dog out for a quick walk and locked up. It takes about 20 minutes to walk around the cul-de-sac, and we stopped to chat with other neighbors, so we got back at around 8. When we walked into the hallway, the basement door was open again. I asked Sarah if he'd locked it, and he said he did. He texted one of the upstairs neighbors asking if they'd gone down there. We got a pretty quick answer that no, they hadn't left their apartment at all. The neighbor, Andy, made a joke that maybe it was a ghost, but then quickly said it was probably just trick-or-treaters being weird. We tried to brush it off and had 2 more groups of kids come by before we turned off the porch light and packed it in for bed. Sarah was being a little weird and wanted to check the basement door again. I scoffed but was nervous, and when she looked through the peephole, the basement door was completely open. It was actually open so wide that it was blocking our door and Sarah couldn't see into the hallway. Both of us on edge, we opened our door. I had a heavy flashlight in hand just in case, and decided we had to go down to make sure no one was in the basement. We live in a safe area, but we're thinking maybe someone just randomly came into the apartment. That would be really weird, but the door isn't actually locked, just latched. Sarah and I went down and very, very slowly and checked the basement. We turned on every light and shone the flashlight in corners, but it was empty. When we got back up, I latched the door myself and jiggled it to make sure it was closed tightly. This time, Sarah texted our neighbor Andy to give him another heads up that the door had been open. Since it was Halloween, I tried to shrug it off as just a weird night, with teens messing around or something, and eventually got to sleep. Sarah had to wake up early the next morning to go to work. She came back into the bedroom and woke me up to show me that the basement door was open again. Someone had opened it in the night, sometime after 11 in the evening when we went to bed. He locked it hurriedly, and I agreed to reach out to our landlady. She was concerned, but could only offer to put an actual lock on the door. She's supposed to be coming later this week to do so. Since Halloween, every single night the basement door gets opened, no matter how tightly we latch it or what we put in front of it. Sarah actually put a chair up against the handle one night and it was still open the next morning. We have no idea what's going on, but maybe our neighbor is right, and it actually is a ghost. Like I said, we live in a historic neighborhood. We've checked several times and haven't seen or heard a person going down there, but there's no way for the latch to just come undone by itself.